if you walked into like a university literature class today and claimed that India had absolutely no history of the novel before the British arrived, you would probably get an A.
Oh, easily.
Right, because it is the standard accepted academic timeline. But according to the research we are unpacking today, you would also be entirely spectacularly wrong.
Yeah, it's a massive blind spot in how we understand global storytelling. I mean, we have internalized this very specific set of rules for what counts as a serious narrative, and we rarely stop to ask who actually wrote those rules, or, more importantly, whose history those rules are erasing.
And that is our exact mission for today's deep dive.
Hmm.
We are basically taking a hammer to the standard definition of the novel. So we are working from this really fascinating stack of notes centered on an academic analysis by Dr. Jaswant Kumar V. Rathod. And he is breaking down this groundbreaking essay by a scholar named Kapil Kapoor, which is titled Theory of the Novel, An Indian View.
The stakes here are fascinating because, well, this isn't just an argument about books. It is an argument about how we judge other cultures.
Yeah.
Kapoor is actively questioning a heavily Western-centric standard of literature, and he is showing us that India had its own massive, incredibly sophisticated prose narrative tradition centuries before colonial modernity even existed.
I promise you, by the time we finish today, you're going to look at the whole concept of storytelling and probably that bookshelf sitting in your living room in a completely different way. So, okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp what India was doing with its stories, we first have to recognize the trap we are already stuck in. We have to look at the artificial boundaries we place around the word novel.
That is the necessary starting point for sure. When you study literature today, almost anywhere in the world, the definition of a novel is filtered through a strictly Western, mostly 19th century lens.
Like a checklist.
Exactly. There's a literal checklist. It has to be a modern prose form. It is expected to be grounded in strict social realism. It is almost entirely centered on the individual protagonist. And, it is deeply connected to middle-class life.
Meaning urban environments, private psychology, that sort of thing.
Right, and the physical experience of a reader sitting alone in a room, reading silently to themselves.
So we are talking about the classic English or French novel. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about Charles Dickens writing about orphans in London, or Jane Austen focusing on middle-class marriage politics.
Precisely. And those are masterworks, of course. But Kapil Kapoor's central argument is that this definition is dangerously narrow if we try to apply it globally.
Because it excludes everything else.
Yeah, if we use this very specific 19th century European yardstick to measure the entirety of human literature, we come to a completely false conclusion about India. We look at ancient and medieval Indian texts and say, well, they don't look like Charles Dickens, therefore, India had no novels.
Which inherently implies this incredibly condescending idea that there was just a giant, empty literary void in India, and everyone was just sitting around waiting for the British to show up and teach them how to write a long-form story.
Yes, and Kapoor points out how intellectually flawed that is. I mean, literature does not evolve the same way in every culture because cultures value different things. Therefore, one culture's specific structural standard should never be used as the ultimate judge of another culture's literary forms.
Wait, so judging ancient Indian literature by the standards of a 19th century British novel, I mean, isn't that essentially like judging a submarine by how well it flies like an airplane?
Yeah.
It just completely misses the point of what the vehicle was actually built to do in the first place.
What's fascinating here is how perfectly that captures exactly what Kapoor means when he talks about decolonizing literary thinking. For generations, the academic assumption was that Western literature was the evolutionary peak of storytelling.
The absolute pinnacle.
Right. So Indian literature was treated as secondary or primitive simply because it wasn't trying to be an English novel. Kapoor is urging scholars and readers to trust indigenous literary theories. Stop looking at Indian history as a failed version of Europe.
The submarine works perfectly in the water. You just have to stop asking it to fly.
Exactly.
Okay, but that raises the obvious question. If Indian literature wasn't trying to be an airplane-like, if it wasn't trying to be a Western novel focused on a single individual's private psychology, then what exactly was the submarine built for? What was the primary purpose of these massive narratives?
This is where Kapoor makes a really profound pivot. In the modern West, we largely consume stories as entertainment. Or maybe we see them as an expression of a single author's unique artistic angst.
Yeah, it's very individual.
But in the Indian tradition, stories functioned as massive, vital knowledge systems.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Because I have to push back on that a little. Knowledge systems. That sounds incredibly dry. Are we talking about an ethics textbook thinly disguised as a bedtime story? Because if I pick up a novel, I want a plot, I want drama. It sounds like early Indian storytellers were hiding their broccoli in the mashed potatoes.
So,
Like they took deep, dense philosophy and ethics and wrapped it in these massive, dramatic blockbusters to help everyday people process human nature.
that is a great way to put it, and it is a fair concern. But Kapoor argues it is actually the exact opposite of dry. Think about the 20th century. We had massive, highly rational, abstract ideologies. Political sciences, complex economic theories, rigid philosophical schools.
Sure.
But Kapoor points out that those abstract theories completely failed to explain the messy reality of human nature. Rational theories don't explain why highly educated societies suddenly descend into sudden, brutal violence.
Okay, I see. A political science textbook can tell you how a government functions, but it can't explain why a specific leader makes a completely irrational, ego-driven choice that destroys their own country.
Exactly. Abstract theory fails when it meets human irrationality, but stories explain those things perfectly.
Because they deal with emotion.
Right. Stories capture the deep emotional reactions, the blinding ambitions, and the moral compromises that actually drive history. Therefore, in the Indian tradition, literature wasn't just make-believe fiction separate from the real world. It was viewed as the most effective, vital way of transmitting complex truths about how the universe actually operates.
And looking at Dr. Rathod's notes, the ultimate proof of concept for this is the Mahabharata.
Yes, absolutely. Kapoor views the Mahabharata as the quintessential epic novel. Now, often in Western academia, it gets shoved into the mythology or religious text section.
Which kind of diminishes it as literature.
It completely ignores its literary function. It is a staggering narrative achievement. We are talking about intense political maneuvering, complex ethical dilemmas, the sheer psychological horror of war, brutal family betrayals, and deep sorrow. Kapoor actually compares its depth and breadth to massive Western novels like Tolstoy's War and Peace.
But Kapoor actually suggests the Mahabharata is even broader than War and Peace, doesn't he?
He does, and the reason goes back to what we just discussed about knowledge systems. War and Peace chronicles a very specific historical moment, the Napoleonic Wars, and its effect on Russian society.
Right.
The Mahabharata, on the other hand, attempts to encapsulate the entirety of human experience. Think about the famous section, the Bhagavad Gita. You have the warrior Prince Arjuna literally standing in a chariot on the battlefield, looking across the lines and seeing his own cousins, teachers, and uncles on the opposing side.
Right, and he physically collapses. He drops his weapon because he is completely paralyzed by the moral weight of what he has to do.
Exactly. It is an intense, dramatic, psychological moment, but it is also a profound philosophical discourse on duty, action, and the nature of the soul.
The drama is the delivery mechanism for the philosophy.
Yes, it is a massive, human-centered narrative exploring cosmic ethics, and it existed millennia before the modern Western novel was even a concept.
Okay, I am totally on board with the Mahabharata being an epic masterpiece. But if we are talking about the novel as a structural form, is there actual evidence that ancient India had a structured approach to this, or were these just brilliant campfire tales that organically grew over time?
There is absolute structural evidence, and this is where the sheer academic rigor of ancient India really shines. India didn't just produce beautiful stories, it produced a highly advanced scientific approach to categorizing its literature.
Like a formal system.
They had complex literary criticism and narrative theory long before any contact with the West.
I am looking at Kapoor's classifications in the notes here, and it is pretty dense. They didn't just have fiction and nonfiction. They broke prose down into categories like, well, forgive my pronunciation here, Katatha Ashyaka Akhyana Mahakatha Kupakatha and Nidarsana. Am I getting that right?
You are close enough, and the terminology itself is less important than understanding the function behind those words. These weren't just arbitrary labels that a librarian slapped on a scroll. They were rigorous classifications based on the specific mechanics of the story.
So what is the difference between, say, a katha and an akheka? Like, how granular did this literary science get?
Incredibly granular. A katha, for example, was generally understood as a purely imaginative or invented narrative. It might be told by a fictional narrator, and its primary goal was often to explore a philosophical concept or evoke a specific aesthetic emotion in the audience through invention.
Okay, and the other way.
An akrika, on the other hand, was rooted in a historical basis or lived experience. It might still be highly dramatized, but the narrator was usually the author or someone closely tied to the real events.
So they were actively differentiating between purely imaginative fiction and dramatized historical fiction,
Yeah.
and building specific literary rules for how to write both.
Exactly. They categorize narratives by subject matter, by narrator type, by the ultimate purpose of the text, and by the specific emotional effect it was engineered to have on the listener. It was a complete indigenous system of literary science. And it wasn't just ancient poetry. Kapoor highlights numerous pre-colonial prose narratives to prove that long-form, character-driven prose was thriving. Texts like the Bharat-katha, the Panchatantra, Ganbihu Sutra, Harsha-charita, Kadambari, Lilavati, and Samarakakaha.
I mean, take the Panchatantra, for instance.
Yeah.
It is globally famous now as a collection of animal fables.
But structurally, it is a brilliantly complex, interwoven narrative. It uses stories within stories within stories, a deeply sophisticated framing device to teach niti, which is the wise conduct of life and statecraft, to young princes. It is political philosophy wrapped in highly entertaining, structurally complex prose.
Oh, wait, I want to play devil's advocate for a second, because as much as I love this, I'm reading Kapoor's own admission in these notes that these Indian narratives often mix history, myth, fiction, and moral teaching all together in a big blender.
They do.
Right, so you're reading a story about politics, and suddenly a god intervenes or a miracle happens right next to a completely grounded depiction of social anxiety. From a strict literary perspective, doesn't that disqualify it as a novel? I mean, doesn't the novel form demand strict realism?
That question gets to the very heart of the Western bias. Kapoor is challenging. From a 19th century European standpoint, yes, mixing myth and reality makes a text seem unrealistic or perhaps primitive.
Yeah, like a fairy tale.
But Kapoor argues that this mixed blended form is actually a profound literary strength.
Strength.
Yeah.
How does breaking the laws of physics in your story make it stronger realism?
Because human experience itself is layered. We don't actually experience our own lives as a strict, dry sequence of rational material events.
And that is true.
We experience life through the lens of our beliefs, our deep-seated myths, our moral anxieties, and our spiritual hopes, all running concurrently with our daily social realities.
Okay, so if a culture genuinely believes that the divine is actively present in everyday life, then writing a story where the divine interacts with the mundane isn't fantasy. It is actually the most accurate, realistic representation of how that culture experiences the world.
Precisely. The layered quality of these Indian narratives, putting the legendary figure next to the ordinary citizen, the moral debate right in the middle of the emotional drama, captures a much broader, truer picture of human existence than strict material realism ever could.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me because this shifts everything. This leads to one of Kapoor's deepest insights in the entire essay, the concept that realism is not a fixed, universal, objective truth. Realism is culturally subjective.
It raises a vital question we rarely ask. What does it actually mean for a story to feel real? Kapoor draws this brilliant contrast between Western realism and Indian realism. In the West, realism is almost entirely focused on the isolated individual.
Right, it's all about private psychology, like what is going on inside the protagonist's head.
Exactly. Western realism focuses on the accumulation of money, the pursuit of marriage, private desires, urban loneliness, and internal psychological tension. Think of a classic coming-of-age novel.
Sure.
The central driving question of Western realism is almost always, what do I personally feel?
Yeah.
Or what do I personally want out of this world?
And Indian realism, what's the driving question there?
Indian realism is profoundly focused on the societal and the ethical. It is deeply concerned with dharma, which translates roughly to duty, right conduct, or cosmic order.
Okay.
It focuses on karma, meaning action, and the inevitable consequence of that action. It looks at the ethical fabric of the universe. So instead of asking, what do I personally feel, the central driving question of an Indian narrative is usually, what is the right thing to do in this complex situation?
Wow. Okay, let me see if I have this right. So Western realism is sort of like, I don't know, looking through a microscope at a single character session on a therapist's couch. You're zooming in on their unique neuroses. But Indian realism, it's more like sitting in the gallery of a Supreme Court trial, where the fate of an entire community rests on a complex debate about justice. They are both real, but they are answering completely different questions.
That is a fantastic way to conceptualize it. Both the therapy session and the Supreme Court trial are exploring what is real and true about human nature, but they are trying to answer completely different questions. Indian narratives deal heavily with ordinary social life, politics, and relationships, but they frame them through this ethical lens.
Let's ground that in a modern scenario, just to make sure I'm fully grasping it. Say you have a protagonist who gets an amazing job offer across the country, but it requires leaving behind an aging parent who needs care.
Perfect example. The Western realist novel would likely spend 300 pages exploring the protagonist's internal angst, their feelings of being stifled, their desire for self-actualization, their resentment, their eventual decision to pursue their own happiness.
Right. It is a valid, real psychological journey.
Exactly. And how would the Indian narrative framework handle that same scenario? The Indian narrative would explore the cosmic weight of the conflict between responsibilities.
So it's less about their feelings.
It wouldn't ignore the protagonist's feelings, but the narrative tension wouldn't be about self-actualization. It would be about the conflict of dharma, the duty to oneself versus the duty to the parent, and how the choice they make will send karmic ripples through their entire community. The focus shifts from private emotion to ethical action.
That makes so much sense. But why the massive difference? Why did Indian realism evolve to focus so heavily on duty and community, while the West zoomed in so closely on private individualism?
It comes down to the actual delivery mechanism of the stories, how they were physically consumed by the audience, and the fundamental goals of the society that produced them. Let's think about that Western novel again. When you read a modern novel, how do you physically do it?
I buy a paperback, I sit in a chair by myself, and I read it silently in my head. It's an incredibly isolated, private experience. It's just me and the author's words.
Exactly. And because the experience of reading is private, the content of the novel naturally became more private and psychologically isolated.
That is fascinating.
But historically, Indian storytelling was collective and public. Much of it was an oral tradition before it was ever committed to text. These massive narratives were recited, performed, and shared in public gatherings.
Like in temples or during festivals.
Yes, in temples, at royal courts, during major seasonal festivals, and in shared village spaces. The narrative was not a private retreat from the world. It was an active community experience that physically bound people together as they listened.
Ah, I see. If you are sitting shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, your family, and your community while hearing a story, the story is naturally going to focus on how you were supposed to relate to that community. It's inherently social.
Precisely. And because it was a shared community event, the literature was deeply, inextricably tied to the foundational philosophy of Indian thought, specifically the four goals of human life.
Let's break those down from Dr. Rathod's notes, because they seem to be the engine driving these stories. The four goals are dharma, which we discussed as right conduct or duty; artha, which is material well-being or success; kama, which is desire or pleasure; and moksha, which is ultimate spiritual liberation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves Kapoor's ultimate point literary forms are shaped entirely by their cultural environment. You simply cannot separate the structure of a story from the society that built it. Indian stories are deeply concerned with how a human being navigates a meaningful life within the tension of those four goals.
Right, because those goals often conflict with one another.
Constantly. What happens when your pursuit of artha, let's say building a massive, wealthy empire, clashes with your dharma, your duty to rule justly and not harm others?
Or kama getting in the way.
Yes. What happens when kama, a blinding romantic desire, makes you abandon your social responsibilities? The narratives explore these clashes. They are asking the largest, most serious questions a civilization can ask about justice and cosmic balance, always with an eye toward that final goal of moksha, liberation from the cycle entirely.
Which means an Indian story isn't necessarily driving toward a neat, material, happily ever after like a Western marriage plot. It is driving toward a philosophical resolution.
Yes. And if you take a magnificent, complex narrative that is actively trying to answer what is cosmic justice, and you judge it by the structural standards of a book trying to answer who will this middle-class protagonist marry, you are going to completely misunderstand the text. You will fail to see its genius entirely because you are looking for the wrong clues.
You're looking for an airplane and you are staring at a submarine.
Exactly. Kapoor is pleading with scholars and everyday readers to stop forcing Indian traditions into Western boxes. We have to study Indian literature through its own history, its own cultural values, and its own highly developed indigenous theories of storytelling.
Which brings us to the core takeaways for you listening right now.
Yeah.
What Dr. Rathod's analysis of Kapil Kapoor's essay really does is give us permission to rethink literary history from the ground up. We do not need to measure the richness of Indian literature by a 19th century European yardstick.
No, not at all.
We can recognize that India had these incredibly sophisticated, structurally complex, deeply philosophical, and publicly shared prose forms centuries before colonial rule. India didn't learn how to tell a complex, novel-length story from the British. They had been mastering the science of it for millennia.
And regardless of whether you study literature professionally or you just enjoy reading a paperback on the weekends, this matters deeply. This entire discussion is really a profound lesson in critical thinking. It is a reminder that the standard definitions we are taught in school, the default settings of our education, might only represent one tiny, localized fraction of the global human experience. When we assume that our specific way of categorizing the world is the only valid way, we completely blind ourselves to the brilliance of other cultures.
It really does make you look at the categorization of the world in a totally new light. Which brings me to a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up today. We started this deep dive talking about the rigid labels we put on stories, and how judging a submarine by how well it flies completely blinds us to its actual purpose.
Right.
So if we have completely misunderstood the sheer structural genius and depth of ancient Indian storytelling, simply because we were looking at it through a narrow Western lens, what other global traditions, ancient sciences, or cultural histories are we completely misjudging right now, simply because we were holding the wrong measuring stick?
It is a question that requires us to approach the world and our own assumptions with a lot more humility.
It absolutely does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the true origins of the novel. We will catch you next time, but until then, keep asking the big questions.